Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome back to me. Yeah, welcome back to me. From in part, bit of a trip, but equally from my afternoon nap, which I found is a new way of dealing with jet lag now that I'm old, which I never used to experience. But there we go. So, welcome. We're going to spend the next hour, as we always do, editing your photos in that thing there, up there, Capture One. So, Capture One being a piece of software that we use to get the best out of your photographs. It's written by a team of people in Denmark, in Copenhagen, and they are the people behind the RAW editor that we're going to be taking your raw data, the stuff that your camera actually records, onto its sensor, playing with it and either fixing it or enhancing it or improving it, hopefully, in the next session. And we're going to be then looking at the output and the difference between what came in, what came out, and that's the whole point of a RAW editor like Capture One. So for those of you that don't know anything about that software, we'll cover some of the sort of intro stuff very, very briefly at the very beginning. But otherwise, go to capture1.com. You can download a free trial. I think from memory, it's about 30 days. You get full usage. There's no limitations, no nothing. But to all intents and purposes, you're able to follow along if you want to for a month for free. After that, you can choose. You can either subscribe to Capture One, so a monthly payment that allows you to have the latest version of the software always, or you can buy a what's called perpetual license, which means that you keep with that version until you choose if or not to upgrade in future. But either way, free trial. Easy, 30 days. After that, you decide. For those of you that already have Capture One and are already using Capture One, we today are using 15.4.0 to be precise, which is the current latest version of Capture One. So if you're not on that version and you are a monthly subscriber, then you have access to this. You always have access to the latest version. Just go to capture1.com, go to your account in the top right, and you'll find a function in there that says download latest version. If you're on a perpetual license, so you're one of the people that have bought your license allows you to stay within the point version. So in other words, if you're on Capture One 21, you can go 21.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, or as it was 14.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, because there's as you can see there, a little bit of a discrepancy between year number and version number, just like with lots of software. So you can stay on that version, no problem. You can go to a point release. At the point that it changes the big number, the 21 to 22 or the 14 to 15, as it were, that's when it's upgrade time if you choose to. If you're on Capture One 21 or 20, a lot of the stuff that we're going to be using today you can follow along to, no problem. Some of the tools may not be available to you. That's your decision. If you don't use those tools or you don't think they're useful, stay where you are, no issue. There's no gun to anyone's head, but that's your choice. So today we're on 15.4.0. Which is Capture 122. For those of you that have had a keen eye on social media, you will know there is a new version on its way. And the reason we know that is because of two things. Number one, there are currently offers with certain dealers where if you buy Capture 122, you will get access to the next version also, so for no additional charge. The second reason is because they've just done a competition for the splash screen for the new version. So yes, new version imminent at some point this year. Normally it's the end of the year that the new versions come out. That version, again, will be freely available. Not free, you're paying for it, but freely available to those that subscribe. And if you don't subscribe, you can then choose whether or not you want to take it on or not. Right, so a couple things. Martin, that was loud. I had the speakers all the way up. Well, there's a lesson. There's a lesson as well. Certain channels on TV, if you do that by accident, you're in trouble. And Tony, yeah, I have jet lag when I travel in the same time zone. Honestly, I've spent, 25 years traveling, avoiding jet lag by never being in the same time zone. And the last 2 years of being in the same time zone have really screwed up my body. So, new, exciting experiences. Jet lag sucks. Rick, just check the upgrade on perpetual license. The highest number they give me is 15.3.1. I think I know where you're referring to, and we'll cover that in a second, because there is a little bit of a glitch sometimes in the upgrades. So all that said, before we go into Capture One, just going to cover this. So for those of you that don't remember or didn't know, we've got masterclass things now every month, roughly. The last 4 are available to download. They're in the description of this. They're paid classes, but they're on specific topics that we go in depth into. The next one is going to be in, what is that, 3 weeks' time? Something like that, yeah. 25th of October, which is about capturing and editing, most importantly the night sky, but obviously capture in, edit out. So we're going to cover both ends of the spectrum in that session. So if you want to join that masterclass, that's what the description link is about. You can go there, make your decisions. There we go. Let's get into Capture One. So to Rick's question, just quickly, I checked on the upgrade for perpetual license, and the highest number they give is 15.3.1. I'm going to guess, Rick, that you're in preferences in Capture One, and it's here under update that you're looking, and you will see that there is it'll say 15.3.1, and it'll say no update available or something like that. Sometimes this happens. I'm not sure exactly why. So if I go to check for updates, I mean, you can see here, I never ever use this box to update, because my last successful check previously was 2018, I think I saw on there. But this box, while it can be very, very useful, it seems that sometimes it doesn't pick up necessarily the latest version. So if this is the box that you're talking about, Rick, then please go to capture1.com, go to your account, the little person icon on the top right, and scroll down and you'll find download, and under download you will see 15.4. If you're a perpetual license owner for 22 or 15, then that's the version that you should be on now, 15.4, and it is available to you. But if you go to capture1.com rather than through this little update box, you'll find that it's sat there. I don't know why it does that. Sometimes it's a bit weird. Yeah, actually, there you go to Paula. So most of the times I get the no updates or no upgrades available, although there is one. At least, as I say, I don't have an answer. I don't know why it doesn't broadcast it. But what I would do, personally, what I do is keep an eye on any update announcements online, and then just pull them down from the web instead. So we're in Capture One. I said we'd quickly cover stuff for people that are new to it, so we are going to do that very quickly, just in broad terms. So Capture One is based on a browser. This is this on the right hand side. We can move the browser if we want, so we can customize it and say place below for those people that prefer film strip style browsing. Personally, I prefer it on the side, but that's all under the view menu, so we can say place right. You have your tools on the left hand side, and these tabs here are based on a workspace, and you can save and move and control and customize and whatever your workspace to your heart's content. One thing that a lot of people didn't realize until very recently, and hopefully it's started to stick, when you update your Capture One version, just like I've explained, so go to the website, download the latest version. When you do that, Capture One automatically backs up your workspace. Now, please don't rely on this, because I hate it when we say, oh yeah, the software automatically does that, and then the one time you rely on it, it didn't, or something like that. But in general terms, the software will always back up your workspace. You can see in here I've got several, 7, 8. Don't know where 9 went. Anyway, so for example, in 15.3, I think it was, when the new tool tabs were introduced, a lot of people were a little bit confused because the default tabs had been changed and moved, and some of their settings had changed. All you had to do was go Window, Workspace, and load up your backup of your previous tool tabs array. Now, the downside to doing this and saving your custom workspace is any tools that are introduced into Capture One, so all the stuff that goes up here in the toolbars and into the tool tabs, you may not necessarily see because you didn't get that glimpse of them because you went back to a previous workspace that didn't have it. But if you read the release notes and you know the tools that you're looking for, you can always re-customize your workspace. And most importantly, when you've done that, go to Save Workspace. Save it as the workspace that you want to use. Most people use their name or something like that, or laptop, desktop, dual monitor, whatever. But save your workspaces, have them laid out differently. The reason being, for some things like black and white work, you might want a slightly different array of tool tabs to that of color work. So why not have a workspace saved for black and white and one for color? For some people, it's about 2 monitors versus 1 monitor. Some people, it's when their laptop is on their lap. There you go, it makes sense. Versus when they've plugged their laptop in, they've got another external monitor. They might have a slightly different workspace. So use the workspace saving ability to customize this stuff, because everything that I change up here can be saved into your personal workspace. So a few examples. To a lot of people, if I go to customize toolbar, if you're not going to use things like the iPad app, don't have an iPad, whatever, then you can probably get rid of cloud transfer, because it's not going to pull anything down from an iPad app that you're not using. Some people don't want live. Capture One Live is a great tool for reviewing and collaborating, but if you don't do that with anyone, then give yourself some real estate. You might not want capture if you're not going to do any tethering stuff, for example. Proofing, I would encourage people to have on there. We've covered this before. I'll cover it briefly in this session as well, as to why you might want that up there. But, I have annotations up. I have guides up. Guides is a really handy one, because if I want to actually view guides here, I've got to assign a keyboard shortcut to it if I want to do it very quickly, or I just have a guides button up here. So you can choose what's on here. Once you've made those choices, window, workspace, save. Same with tool tabs. Any of the changes that you make in here will be saved with that workspace too. So for those that are new in, there's our browser on the right. Here is our viewer. Here are our tools, which expand and contract on the left-hand side. And they are in a rough order, but not really. And the advantage that you have with Capture One is, well, not only tooltips that will tell you how to do it, but if I hold down the Command key or Control key in Windows, I can drag the order of these things to my own working style. So maybe I do start with lenses, then, maybe actually it doesn't make sense that I do styles next. Maybe my styles is, I don't know, next to export, for example. But these are all completely customizable, and you should do that. Just really, really design Capture One around the way that you work, rather than necessarily trying to learn the way that a software developer has designed it. Now, bear in mind that Capture One out of the box is designed for photographers. The people in Copenhagen that write it are in many ways photographers. Many of them are. They're working photographers. So they have a view, but it may not match yours, and that's okay. But I would genuinely try and get this molded around your way of working, rather than trying to mold yourself around it. It's one of the things that when I sit with people and they say, I'm really struggling with, for instance, on these tool tabs, why is it that this tab is always expanded and this one isn't? Change it. Change your tool tabs. Don't sit there and struggle with why. Just build it around you instead. So, with all that said, we've got this picture on the screen, which is Georg's picture, which we are going to edit very quickly. So, the question that Georg sent in, and just for reference, it's really useful. There's something that I say at the end of these sessions, which some people seem to not ever hear. If you don't tell me your name, we will not include your picture. It is that simple. So please, when you send your image in, please include your name. Georg did, but several people don't, and it means that we just can't include your image. So if you're going to send them in, paulreeferlive.wetransfer.com. That's also going to be covered at the end. You'll also see it in the description. But please, please include your name, as well as, just like Georg did, a list of what the issues are. And in this case, the concern is that this has been brought up he's tried, I think, 3 different ways of trying to balance out a very high contrast scene. So I've just pressed the Y key on my keyboard, which gives me a before and after slider. It's the same as pressing this button up here for before and after. This is the original. This is the edit. So original, edit. And the edit has been brought up so we can see a lot more detail in the shadow. We can see a lot more detail in the highlights because those have been brought down. Especially, let's have a look. Where are we? Maybe in here. Let's just zoom to this point here. So on the right hand side we've got the edits, and as you can see there's more texture in there. On the left hand side was the original. But there's a big but. We've got a few false colors here. So you see this concrete has gone from sort of, I guess, grey-ish to maybe a greeny color. So that's a bit of an issue you see on this concrete here from left to right. We've also got, there's some, it looks like heavy diffraction in there, which is a bit of an issue, but we can deal with that. And overall, the image is balanced in terms of, I think Georg said in his note that, he wanted the symmetry of the two doors, kind of. But it is flattened. It's very flattened. And I don't think it necessarily needs to be. So let's have a little look at what we're going to start from, because one thing that's always telling in these, when I go to our tab along our, on our, where? There we are, base characteristics. I got lost because I've been playing around with tabs. I was confused as to where that had gone. So the one thing that I'm going to look at, whenever I see a high contrast image, and by high contrast we mean something with exceptionally bright highlights and very dark shadows. So let's create a new variant. So this is the variant without any alterations, without any changes. If I click on exposure warning, there isn't actually any warning coming up. There would be if I pushed our exposure too much. We start to get some of this. There's little red marks, but there's nothing that's actually really pushed into a bright exposure. But the first thing I always look at, as I say, is this curve, because if I am dealing with a very high contrast image, the auto curve, and for clarity, that curve is exactly the same curve as film standard. So if you choose auto or film standard, you're getting the same response out of your raw data. So if I use film standard or auto, it's building in an S curve. It's building in some contrast into that curve. And that contrast means that the dark areas get darker and the light areas get lighter. So if I leave this on auto and I've got a high contrast raw file like what this is, then that auto curve is actually crushing these dark parts more than even the raw data had in the first place. And there's a way to fix that. We can choose this curve, which is linear response. Now, don't be alarmed. Let me just show you something. Because you notice there it got darker, and I just said that linear response doesn't crush the dark parts so much. Well, it doesn't in comparison to the rest of the data in the histogram. So what do we mean by that? Let's go to our exposure tab. I'm going to pull up our exposure with the auto curve enabled, and I'm looking at the histogram here so that this part here almost touches the right hand side. And you can see we've dragged, there's a huge amount of extra shadow data. In fact, in here, look, we've got all this extra data. The problem with doing that drag is as I've pulled up the shadow data to be able to see it, as you can see, we've also started to blow some of the highlights. Now, if I go to that curve from auto and change that curve to linear response, look at that difference. Auto curve, if ever you wanted to see how much the auto or the film standard curve actually pushes things, this here is a high contrast image. It's got deep shadow and bright highlights. It's a little underexposed in the original raw. But we've adjusted the exposure to make, and you can see up in that top left, this histogram is kind of as far as we can get. It's as far to the right as we can get it, and as far to the left as we can get it with all the data in. And you can see that it's clipping. There's still some really dark shadows, but also there's some really bright highlights that are getting overblown. If I switch the curve to be linear response instead, look at the difference. Look at the difference in the histogram on the left-hand side. So there's auto or film standard, if you want. Linear response. Film standard, linear response. And what it's doing, because it's also, as I say, making the change. If you look at the picture, look at the difference in the highlights and look at the difference in the shadows. So the shadows fall off softer. They may appear a bit darker. The reason they appear a bit darker is because we've now got more latitude to push the highlights further along the right-hand side. You can see from the histogram here. So with linear response enabled, I can actually allow for probably, I don't know, 2.5 stops, yeah, worth of exposure push without, let's just turn on our exposure warning. There's no warning here. There's nothing that's actually clipped beyond, even these white parts here. Let's just move my mouse in. They look like they're really bright, but where are we at? 223 on the top. And I'm looking at these numbers along the top. This is my readout. Wherever my mouse is, it's giving me the RGB values. In this case, it can also show CMYK as well. But in this case, RGB 226, that's not overblown. In fact, we could push it a bit further. So in fact, what we can do as well is I can put a little readout. So here, that's a permanent readout now. So as I'm changing my exposure, I don't have to keep going backwards and forwards with the mouse. I can just see, where are we at? 244, 243. I'm going to push it to 240. That does me. That's your color readout. It's hidden under the white balance picker. If I want to delete it, I can click on there, and that deletes that readout as well. But a lot of the time, you'll see people, especially retouchers, with these readouts all over the screen. That's what they're doing. So it's a way of having a permanent reference within that image for the darkest parts and the lightest parts. So I could leave that there, and let's pick on a dark part. So maybe there. So 5766. Good. So now wherever I am in the image, I've got a readout here for my brightest part and a readout here for my darkest part, just as a reference. Now, with that done in linear response, I could pull down maybe a bit of white detail, maybe a bit of highlight detail. That's pretty good there. So we're rescuing, in quotes, quite a lot. We've pulled this down to 216. So bear in mind, as we pull data down from the highlights or up from the shadows, bring it into the middle of the histogram, what we're doing is flattening the image. So we're losing contrast, which again, you've got linear response already lost some contrast, and now we're going to lose some more. So shadows, well, let's pull those up just a touch. I don't want to pull just shadows blanket up because that gets a lot of the rest of the shot. I'm going to use the specific slider here, which is black. And black, you see, focuses on the targeted parts in here that we want to pull up from this door and in this alleyway here. Small amounts. We're not pulling this thing up to crush everything into the middle. If you move everything into the middle, and here's the temptation. So if I go highlights down, whites down, shadows up, blacks up. Oh man. So we now have in here a lovely bell curve within our histogram. The bell curve tells us there is no contrast in this shot at all. In fact, the shadows have gone from 52 and the highlights top out at 174. In our real image, highlights are in the 200s realm. Pretty good. Shadows are down in the less than 10 realm. So still pretty deep shadows, still visible. But what I've got in this version here, as opposed to this version here, we'll talk about the brightness bit in a minute, is a more natural color without any of the shifting that happens as a result of, in this case, in Georg's version, the saturation being slid up. So saturation added 37, brightness has had to be compensated for, a little bit of HDR, but not too much. But this was about, there's a graduated filter on the right to darken that side. There's a graduated filter on the left to brighten that side. These are all, clever, smart, clever ways of doing this stuff. But it results in something which is a little bit unbalanced, and also you're getting, as you see, false colors, and you're getting some weird effects. So in here, so why is this more washed out? Well, we pushed that exposure by quite a long way, remember. So if we want it to come down, I'm going to just pull that exposure down a little bit. Maybe, do we want too much or that much saturation? Maybe not. So maybe a little bit of saturation, but not too much. And then what I'm going to do is we're going to do something very specific with the Luma range on the right-hand side. So I'm going to create a layer. So you saw on Georg's version here, we've got a graduated filter on the left to brighten that area. It's just an exposure move. And a graduated filter on the right to darken that area. So another by one stop. The problem is it's darkening everything, not just the brightest parts. Well, we have a tool for that. So in my right hand side, I'm going to create a nice soft graduated filter. I can press M on my keyboard for mask to be able to see the mask. Fine. This is almost my safety net because my graduated filter means that it's always 100% here and always 0% here, regardless of if something else is picked up by what I'm about to do. So my graduated filter gives me a safety net to know I'm applying it mostly to the right and a little bit less, well, none to the left, but a little bit less in the middle. With that GND or graduated filter, go to Luma Range. And we're going to include everything that's bright and start restricting the darkest parts. So this chart here under Luma Range says, for the mask that I've drawn, within that mask, please only include this chunk of the histogram. So let's have a little look. And we're gonna slowly fade it out. So in other words, just read these numbers. In fact, let's be really neat. So from 0 to 50, this is what Capture One's thinking. I don't care where you've drawn a mask. If you're anywhere between 0 and 50 on the histogram, you're not included. From 50 up to 100, we slowly include you from 1% to 2%, 3%, 4%, up to 100% of whatever mask there was included. And then from there, everything included. Great. Put a little bit of radius on the edges so we don't notice any fall off. Now, if I now pull down that exposure on this right-hand side, I'm only really affecting the brightest parts of the image and mostly on the right-hand side of the image. So we can pull down that brightness one as well. There we go. And we could even, on those bright parts, put in a touch of clarity. That gives us a bit of a contrast pop. So even though we've brought down the brightness, I still want some contrast, and we can use a micro adjustment. So this clarity here, that typically targets the grayscale areas of the image. Now, these very bright parts, or the brightest parts here, I may want to lift up just a touch. So it seems counterintuitive that I'm pulling up whites in there, but I want the very, very, very whitest parts to still keep their shininess, as it were, and the other parts to dull down. Now from there, if I wanted to, it's choices, we could push that saturation a little bit more, but instead what I'm going to do is actually use our contrast tool here by a couple of points on background here. You could do it on a filled layer. We teach people to do it on a filled layer quite often because it's easy to reverse, but I'm also going to put a little bit of clarity on there as well. Now finally, it may not be quite straight, so let's just, how do you use electric wires as a straightening tool? Anyway, let's just use our straightening tool, which is the little circle, or sorry, the arrow around a little plus sign in the middle. And that gives us kind of a straight image. It's not quite though, is it? Let's just try the auto keystone function. Yeah, so it thinks it was kind of straight. Now in here, let's just go into this area here. Really, I'm being unfair. We're at 400%. You can see the magnification up here on the top right. Diffraction correction on, diffraction correction off. It's not a huge amount of difference, but I believe there is some diffraction in this image. And I'm seeing it where, you know, I'm not seeing any of that stuff here in the middle of the lens, but out towards the edges, we're starting to see this sort of slight blurriness. If diffraction correction doesn't help with that, what we can use is what's called sharpness fall off. And that will help, it's not going to fix it, but it will help keep the sharpness back on that right-hand side. So this is overdoing it. This is where I would get to. This is Georg's original. Now, Georg's original has got a lot of depth in it because of that color shift. But look at this door here. There is a tiny amount of color for whatever reason. It may be a bounce back of light, because I've noticed as well up here, it's almost like blue spray paint or something like that up in the top. But by using that saturation, you end up pulling these up probably a little bit too much. And they end up with this weird color shift, which doesn't quite make sense. I'm just going to delete these two color readouts because they're getting in the way now. Okay, so in here we have a less saturated image, but here's a fun one, because I wasn't going to do, actually, a bit of a side note. Someone asked me last week, how much we practice on the images that get sent through. Used to. So when we started doing this a couple of years ago, we used to load them up and just work out which ones we're going to play with and so on. Now we just pick 3 or 4 and we go. So what you're seeing is my thought process live. There's no trick or rehearsal in this stuff now. So Paula, to your point, this is a nice one to create contrast with color balance tool. Yes. So let's just go into our color tab here, because what we have here is a huge amount of data in the shadows, a reasonable amount of data in the midtones, and a bit of data up in the highlights. So let's create a new filled layer. And when I said before about doing it on the background versus a filled layer, the reason for doing it on the filled layer is that we can edit that layer, we can delete it, we can change the opacity of the layer, we can change the amount that the tool has an effect on the image without having to go into the tool and actually change the parameters, because we can just turn the layer on or off. Now in your color tab, which is the one with the 3 little circles, if I go into our color balance tool, which is the one that everyone's scared of because you can make some very horrific mistakes with this thing, the good news is you can always undo it. So if you really screw stuff up, just double click in the tool and it'll put it back to the center. And that's the same for any tool. So if we really do stuff roll wrong, double click, goes back to the center, goes back to 0 or the reset point. So what Paul is talking about is in our color balance tool here, whether you do it through master, 3-way, or these, which are basically the shadow, midtone, and highlight versions of these, are all combined into this one central tool with the 3. I can change the color balance. So in other words, the shift of hue and the saturation and the brightness of the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights independently. So this here is our saturation on the left, this slider. This here is our brightness on the right. And here we've got a general, and you see the slider on the left changing as I go out towards the edge of the circle and back in. So this is desaturate or no saturation. This is mid saturation of orange. This is full saturation of orange. For the shadows, it's only changing the shadows. So in our shadows, we could go into a nice sort of, I don't know, deep blue. We could even darken down the shadows now a little bit. We've got a bit of latitude to be able to do that. You've got to be careful with this door though. That's the only thing to be aware of. But yes, we could deepen it and darken it down. The highlights. What if we made the highlights slightly warmer? So we've got sort of midday sun. What about more yellow, more green, more blue, more pink, more red, whatever. One thing we can do is use this to knock out that green effect. So you remember that on the door, this had started to turn a little bit to the sort of green cyan place. Some of it is mid-tone, it's not all highlight, but if we move away from the cyan and green area, in other words, the opposite direction, we warm up the image, but we also knock out some of that color and the amount of color that's in there. So we can change our saturation of that orange tint. We can change our brightness of the highlights again. So maybe we want to actually increase them just a little bit. Midtones. How do we want the image to feel? So if shadows is your sort of cool, dark area of the image, and highlights is the light source, as it were, so think about it in those terms, the midtones is generally the tone or the feel or the mood of the image, because it's all the stuff in the middle. So if I want the image to go colder, so this becomes more, middle of the day, this becomes more sunset glow, this becomes more pink, and this becomes more green. So if I wanted this to be a bit more sunsetty, like that, that's how we do it with the color balance. So we've moved our highlights to be a bit more red, our midtones to be a bit sort of yellowy, golden, orange, and our shadows slightly blue. Now, if I turn this layer off, we can do that because we created it as a layer. We go from this greeny tint, you can see now how green that tint feels on this shot, to be much warmer. Now we could do some of that with white balance. So remember, on your white balance, we can also warm up the image or cool down the image. We can also change tint. We can go more pink or more green. The issue, however, with white balance is this is a global adjustment. Color balance lets us do that, or the hue change and the saturation change, independently between shadows, midtones, and highlights. So to Paula's point, let's just go back to it. You can create contrast with contrast. You can create contrast with sharpness, but you can also create contrast through color. Because by separating out, and typically if we're going to do a split tone like this, so shadows to one side of the wheel, highlights to the other side of the wheel, that's what creates quite a harmonious contrast in color. If we split them out, that drives the picture to separate its highlights from its shadows, and it becomes very, very obvious which ones are meant to be bright, which ones are meant to be dark, because their color has changed to be on one side or the other. So I personally would go, let me just get rid of that comment there. So instead of this, which feels it does feel saturated, which is a good thing, don't get me wrong, but it feels very rich. And the problem with that is things have started to turn an odd cast in some of this stuff. I would be happy leaving some of this contrast in here and some of the darkness. I'd also be happy with that shift of color to allow us to do it. I wouldn't push it this far. But if I go from our original to here, this just feels a bit more natural to my mind. Tony, the roll off between shadow, midtone, and highlights in the tool is really nice. Yeah, so what you've got to bear in mind is that these tools, so midtones isn't literally the middle block. It doesn't just drop off. Just like on a Luma range, you actually have a fall off, and those fall offs actually crisscross. So shadows encroaches a little bit into midtones, and midtones encroaches a little bit into shadows. So you do get a nice fall off between the two tools. It does work. Where are we, Rick? So can't you use white balance with a mask to make it work on just part of the image and change the opacity effect? Yes, you can. Sorry about the all caps. That's all right. You made your point. Yes, you can. So absolutely. But just think about how you're going to mask it. All right, because it's not just a case of. I mean, what we could do, for example. Actually, let's just do this very quickly. So let's create a new filled layer. So to Rick's point, I can create a filled layer. I'm going to turn my mask on there. So we're all red there. And I can say in my mask, Luma Range, everything dark up to, I'm guessing, let's say up to 90. No, less than that. Let's go 70. Up to there. Yeah, apply. So I've now got a shadows area. Let's create a new filled layer. We'll call this one highlights, Luma Range, so everything up there, everything there, and then a nice fall off. And then I could create a new filled layer, call this midtones, Luma Range, there to there with a nice soft fall off. So that's my midtone. So I've now got 3 luminosity masks effectively. And in my shadows, I could say, well, I'm going to cool them down. That's cool. And in my highlights, I'm going to warm them up a bit and also increase some of the tint to make it more pale. We're just playing. Mid-tones, we're going to really warm them up and make them a bit green. I don't know why we'd do that, but anyway. So yes, you can split out different areas of the image based on their brightness, or you could physically mask it and then say, well, the midtones I want to have this white balance, the highlights this white balance, the shadows this white balance. But isn't that an awful lot of work when they've already done it for you here in the tool? That's where I get to. So color balance isn't quite the same as white balance. It's not changing the tone of those pixels based on a Kelvin scale or a tint. It's actually allowing you to move all around the different hues that are available. But what it is a lot easier and a lot quicker to get to the result you want, rather than creating all these different Luma ranges for what the tool has already done. Now on that grading one, if I did want to introduce any more contrast in here, it would probably be with a touch more clarity, a little bit of structure. And if I want to get rid of the sort of I guess washed out appearance of this, what we can use is dehaze. A little bit of dehaze. So not too much, between 15 and 20. You can choose your haze color if you want, but it's actually pretty much grabbed it here correctly. But that's where I'd end up. So, background layer, we've changed the base characteristics. That's the most important thing. So we've got all of our data back by using linear response rather than pushing the two. On the right hand side, we have got a layer in there with a Luma range that basically pulls down our exposure, pulls down the brightness, but then pushes the very, very brightest parts back up to where they should have been. And then we've got a grading layer to add some color in. So let's just do these like a sandwich. There's our base. There's our right hand side. There's our color grade over the top, which is also now including a bit of dehaze. Sorry, where you put dehaze is up to you. You could put it in the grading layer. You could put it in a separate layer on its own. So, Joe, what about reducing overall saturation in the original image? Yes. So if I go to basic edits and pull down that saturation, we get to a washed out look for sure. But it doesn't have this, it doesn't have the richness that these changes have had because it relied on saturation to make it pop. So once we remove the saturation from where it was, I can't actually remember where it was in the 30 something. Once we remove that, if that's what's driving our ability to see the differences in the image, well, then I lose everything when I pull that saturation down because this has become such a key component to the edit. If I didn't use it in the first place, I've just got a more neutral image. And that's, to me, it's about keeping grey concrete grey rather than green, for example. And what's happening is that saturation tool, there's probably some sort of light source or a bounce back or maybe even old graffiti like it looks like up here with a tiny touch of that green or cyan in it. And the saturation tool is just grabbing that and running away with it. So that's where I'm sort of tempted to get rid of that approach and use something different. Rick, to your earlier point, playing with white balance is less scary than the color balance tool until we get the hang of it. Yes, I agree. So the white balance tool, pretty simple. Warmer, colder, pinker, greener. Fine. The color balance tool looks a little bit scary, but I'll tell you a little handy hint with it. If any of you have got styles, any styles, doesn't have to be the ones that we have, but if you have styles, go to apply a style. I mean, this is going to be a little bit over the top because we've got a new one, but apply a style. Let's just pull up shadows here onto an image. Okay. Have a look. This is how people learn this stuff. Have a look at what's happened in the color balance because a lot of the styles in Capture One use color balance to make the changes rather than white balance. So have a look at what's happening, see what happens to the picture, see what a difference that color balance tool has made to the final image, and then replicate it. If you find that you like cool shadows, warm highlights, or slightly pinkish shadows and slightly greenish highlights or whatever, learn how those tools are working, learn what they're doing by seeing. So, apply a style, see what it did, work out what's going on, and then use that to your advantage. Take it, copy it, reapply. Okay, Daniel, this shot here. Sorry, I'm just going to stop myself coughing. Genius how liquid works. So Daniel's shot in here. It's been a long day and night. Let's have a look at what's in focus, because actually Daniel's alluded to this in his note. So we have a background that's very much in focus. A really cool scene. Actually, I like this. Need to maybe have a look at it. Looking at the title, I'm thinking that's Croatia. And the foreground is out of focus. Now, this is known, so there are two versions of this image, one with the foreground in focus, one with the background in focus. Now, obviously, a couple of things. If you have a tilt shift lens, that could help with this, but also shooting at something smaller than f10 would have also given you potentially this in focus as well as the background. At 39mm, you might have needed to be out at sort of f16 or something like that. But that will allow you access to a much deeper depth of field. That will allow you to be able to, now just be clear, it's not necessarily making things sharper, but it's allowing you to make things appear sharper for a lot longer distance. F16 comes with its own challenges around diffraction versus something like f8 or f11. But in this case here, we have the waterfalls out in the distance, very much in focus, nice and sharp. Nice long exposure here with this moving water. Personally, I'd have liked to have seen something a little bit more, I guess, organic. It sounds stupid to say with water, but a little bit more organic in the water, in that this is a very, very short, long exposure, if that makes sense. Sorry, yes, JD, yeah, all focus stacking. So yes, you can focus stack these, so you can take several images, one close to you, and you'd use a very wide aperture for this to get the sharpest out of the lens. So one close, one further, one further, one further, until you get out to everything in the distance being in focus. And then you use something like Helicon Focus, which plugs into Capture One, and that allows you to join all of those together in the sharpest parts. Problem with focus stacking, and just to have a think about this, if you've got moving clouds or moving water or moving people or basically anything moving, focus stacking can be one of your worst nightmares, because the blending that happens between those frames, because remember, the frames aren't taken at the same time. So there is a period of time that spans between the first frame and the last frame. If a wave has moved, if the cloud has moved or something like that, that focus stacking can go pretty horrendously wrong. So just bear in mind, there's a right time for focus stacking and a wrong time. You may have got away with it with this shot here, but it's not always going to be the answer. So smaller aperture can help. You wouldn't still focus right here. You'd probably focus around here. At f16, you might have got this in and the background, but we don't. We don't have the foreground in sharp focus. Now, if that's intentional because we want to push the viewer's line of sight up towards the background, then great. But then I have a question, which is, then why have we made the foreground such a key component, such a vivid element of this scene? So there's our original. Here's Daniel's edit. It's obviously gone a lot cooler. It's gone a lot greener, but I haven't really helped the viewer push their viewport, or as it were, up to the subject that clearly was the bit that we're trying to make them look at, which is out into the distance. So where are we, Bobby? I prefer a tilt shift lens, although it's hard to manage tilt. Yeah, so if you've got a tilt lens, you can, separately to the sensor, if the sensor is here on this plane, I can tilt the lens so it tilts off parallel to the lens or to the sensor. So you can actually shift the plane of focus out into the distance for effectively the top of the image and into the foreground for the bottom. The challenge you have here with a tilt lens is up here, because there is a risk with that focal plane shift that this tree ends up out of focus at the top and in focus at the bottom or something like that. So just, yeah, again, for every single solution, there are things or issues to think about. So let's just create a new variant. So this is the original with no crop. This is the cropped version. So which do we prefer? That's personal choice, honestly. I'm going to go into this one and just see what's happened. So we've got, where are we? We've got these rocks here. We've got the background, which is called house. So I'm guessing that is someone's house. If it is, it's leaking. We've got a huge clarity bump and a massive sort of HDR pull. And if you look at this image, what you can see, and I'll refer back to Georg's image just now, these sliders here, when I see highlights down, shadow up, whites all the way down, and so on, I start to get the impression that what's happening is we're crushing this data from its original out here. Look at this. We've got a big bump in shadows, big bump in highlights. Here, our edited one, that's all been squashed together. Squashing together is very tempting because it means that everything is in detail, everything is pretty much, nicely exposed, but there's no grit left because it's all been flattened out. And that worries me because it's contrast that we love seeing. Our eyes love, they get drawn to contrast. So let's clone that. I'm going to clone Daniel's edits. And all I'm going to do is just back away some of these just very quickly, just to see whether we can just pull things back a little bit. So I'm going to pull back the saturation and this. These rock ones here, what do we got? The shadow came down a bit more. Yeah, so that's okay. There's a bit more clarity on those rocks. I'm just going to wipe out. And our background has something, yeah, so something's been done on here. So let me just have a look there. It's a very small shift. I'm going to move this to be a bit warmer and maybe a little bit more tinted. Ooh, so interesting. As you saw there, I'm making changes here and it's not having much of an effect. The reason being that there's another white balance layer over the top, which is this one. So this is the one that I'm going to make just a little bit warmer and a little bit more pink. And if I want these greens and these cyans and all that sort of stuff to really pop, well, we've just talked about one tool for that as well. So I'm just going to settle these down a bit more. And let's go to our color balance tool. Because in my background, I've got shadows, I've got highlights, I've got midtones. So in my shadows, if I want these areas to be more green and lush, I can do that. If I want them to be more cyan like that, then on that is, I think, probably the sweet spot there. So let me just temporarily undo. So that's before, that's after. And all I've done is I've cooled down and blued up. Let's call it that, blued up. I don't know, made more blue. We'll go with that. The shadows. Now that's had an effect of making this water over here and the mist over here. So this won't be included in it, but this stuff here is also going to go quite blue. So with our highlights, I'm just going to warm that up a little bit. Let's maybe go to there, just to counter the sort of greeny blue effect that's going to happen here as a result of this shift in those shadows. Same with midtones. Well, I can warm that up a touch there. Right. Now, what about this area here? Well, new layer, foreground, darken. Guess what we're going to do? I'm not going to use Magic Brush. We could do, but I don't think there's any need. So Magic Brush would try and work out what's a tree and what's not. I'm just going to set this down to a nice low opacity. I'm going to turn my mask on so I can see what we're doing. And we're just going to draw in a really rough mask. And just to be clear, I'm not worried about this being less than perfect, because it's definitely not going to be perfect. Why? Because light falls on these rocks in a less than perfect way as well. So I'm going to be adding a couple of extra strokes worth of mask into our foreground here and leaving certain bits behind. So a bit more opacity for this very corner up there. And you can guess why we're doing this, because if we want to push the viewer to look out into the distance, then that's what we've got to do. If I want to see what I've actually done with the mask, press Option and M, and we can see the mask itself in grayscale. So you can see how rough that mask is. But here's the cool bit. Now, with that mask like that, I can pull down my exposure, maybe to there. And with that extra mask, I can cool things down even further in the very darkest parts of this image. And that gives us this sort of like lead up. So this becomes a border, this becomes a boundary for me to look at the stuff that's behind. Now, if I want to really look at the stuff that's behind and really make it pop, well, I can go for a new layer. We'll call it pop. Just a couple things up. Where are we? So JD, about focus stacking. So I agree about movement. The shutter speed is constant. It would have worked other than the mist off the waterfall. So it would for the waterfall for focus stacking, but this water down here, absolutely not. This swirl here that you would have, let's say, in focus in this shot, the swirl has disappeared by the next slice that's been taken. So you've now got the focus stacking software trying to work out, well, how do I stack a sharp half of a swirl and a sharp no swirl, or a sharp bit of a swirl and a sharp swirl in a different place, depending on where it is in the image. So just, it's fine. You can get away with it for sure, but just be careful with it. Jeff, would frame averaging still cause the same issues as you mentioned for focus stacking? No, because with frame averaging, what you're getting is that data being average or meaned out. So you've got it. Let me actually be clear. It can, but as long as you frame average for long enough, that's the effect of the smoothing that the averaging does. So if a cloud is moving across the sky, if you're not careful, the cloud's moving really fast and you don't do enough frames, you can get this non-organic, and you'll see on the back of a digital back, it will say gap as a warning. This sort of front of a cloud going, you know, click, 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 because the average, there's not enough cells, there's not enough frames to even out that movement of the cloud. If you want a more natural frame average look, so a long exposure look for a frame average shot, you need lots and lots of frames, or make sure that the digital back is doing it in continuous mode. Paul, would brushing in on a new layer of foreground, a preset such as soft image sharpen help on this sort of challenge? Yeah, potentially, if you wanted to sharpen this foreground. The challenge that I have is, do we want to? So if we do want to, great. If we don't, then no, because if we do want to leave this out of focus and push the viewer's viewport up to here, sharpening this doesn't help us. That actually flattens out the view. So with my pop layer, let's just go to a nice, probably heavily opaque brush. We're going to do almost the opposite. Oops. See how I don't care about where we're drawing? I might erase that bit out there in a second. But so there we go. Let's just go to our eraser. Not a magic eraser, thank you. I don't want you thinking for me. I just want to get rid of that. So with our area here, I'm not going to use clarity. We're going to use contrast just to really richen that up and really embolden it. We can use a touch of brightness. Now we've done that contrast shift. Might want to use a little bit of saturation. Be careful with that. Don't push it too much. Might want to crush those shadows a little bit more or lighten them up. Either way. But what this gives me is a lead up. So this becomes more of a frame and obscuration, I guess, of the view that you want to look past. By trying to make everything even and flat and push everything into the middle, so this is the original edit, I'm not sure as the viewer what you want me to look at. And that's the key part here. Here, I know what you want me to look at. It's this stuff up here. What I would do, so I wouldn't use the natural vignette, the tool vignette that's in here. I'm actually going to paint in top side vignette with my brush, pretty heavy. Let's make it a very, very big soft brush. And we're just going to paint in along the top and down the side so you can see that mask there. And we're just going to pull that exposure down a touch to that. This, to me, feels, and actually we can also in here just in maybe a subtle brightness shift as well with that foreground darken. But to me, this is forcing me to look out into that distance in there, and it's doing it through the contrast and the darkness versus the light. Yes, we have an unsharp foreground and a very sharp background, but it's not unsharp enough. If you really wanted this to be out in the bokeh of the image, you know, if you'd shot this at, let's say, I don't know, 2.8 or even f4 angle or aimed out of the background, you'd have this so out of focus in the foreground that it would be obvious I want you to look out here. But where it's only slightly out, it's just a bit annoying. That's the challenge. So the risk is, here's our original, you know, and actually I could possibly argue that this is also quite a nice subject on its own, but it is a shame to lose this as the subject in the image. So our original here, it's slightly out. The edit originally from Daniel is this one, which still leaves it slightly out, but everything has just got flatter. Everything has become just more in your face. Everything is the subject, and that's a risk. Whereas in here, we've brought the viewer through this as a portal, and they're now looking up here. This becomes the subject again. And the way we've done that is with those three layers. So you've got a foreground mask to darken. We've popped the middle point of the image, and then we've darkened that very, very top edge as a selective vignette, I guess, if you want to call it that. Just get rid of that bit of the tree out of there. That to me feels more inviting as an image if I compare these two side by side. And we've used that color balance tool. Yes, a good shout, Paula, actually. Color balance sort of works in this case as well, because it's driving us to look at something that's more vivid in the background by maybe cooling down the foreground. Bobby, what about a simpler solution, focusing on the rocks in the front and rely on depth of field to get acceptable shots? Yeah, so that's what I was saying earlier. You'd probably focus around here on this rock down here, well, this rock here, so you can see. You would get acceptable sharpness for sure, and that would work with a smaller aperture, but you do need that smaller aperture, and f10 is not going to quite cut it. Can you make the back part of the image pop by reducing saturation a bit on the rocks and the tree layer you just made? Yes, you can. So let's just go to our foreground darken, and I can pull down saturation. You know, let's not go gray, but yeah, you know, pull it down a little bit. That works too. So there we go. That's it. That's it for today. We've done a lot of work on Georg's here, but also the interface. I can't say this enough times. Please, please, please customize your workspace. Absolutely get on top of how Capture One feels for you. It needs to work around your workflow. That's the whole reason that those clever people in Copenhagen have designed it to be completely flexible. So please use it. But customize your workspace. Remember, it is automatically backed up when you upgrade into here, but do save it manually. Please do. This one here, yes, we've used a bit of color balance to bring some contrast back into this shot, but yeah, relying on saturation for this sort of edit, it's just too much. You're going to end up getting false colors and weird stuff. So do consider using linear response in a high contrast scene. And when you have used it, then you've got a lot more options with those sliders to keep the histogram nice and poppy, so with some contrast but visible. And then on Daniel's shot, yeah, you know, sometimes, you know, that whole less is more. The less I can, or the less I focus on, the more I focus on the thing that you want me to. So if you try and make everything pop, nothing's popping. If I try and darken down and lead the viewer into what I want them to see, then that's the bit that pops, and that's the whole idea. So we will be back again in a month. So, well, for those of you that are joining that masterclass, we'll see you on the 25th. For those of you who are not, we'll see you on editing stuff in a month's time. We'll put that into the Facebook group as well as on YouTube, on the channel and everything like that. For those of you that want to send in pictures, paulreeferlive.wetransfer.com. Again, like I said earlier, please, please, please include your name. If you don't, then unfortunately, we will not include your image. But between now and when we see you next, look after yourselves, and we'll catch you then. Cheers. Bye-bye.